You are listening to the Smart Betting Club podcast with me, your host, Peter Ling. Now, this podcast is sponsored by the Matchbook Betting Exchange, and you can find out more on what they offer smart bettors over at matchbook.com. And if you are interested in learning more what it takes to make a profit betting, please do check out my service for winning bettors over at smartbettingclub.com. Hello and welcome back to the Smart Betting Club podcast. I'm pleased to welcome back to the pod Harry Stewart-Moore, a solicitor and partner at Gardner Leader. Alongside his broad legal work, Harry's built a strong reputation for tackling some of the key issues affecting those of us who bet, so he's perfectly placed to offer some real insight. And we've also included plenty of your questions today, sent in ahead of this recording, covering everything from withheld winning, account closures, to how punters are treated and what can be done to improve things. But Harry, since we last spoke, you've become a bit of a podcast star yourself, thanks to your appearance on the AK Bet show. Are you being stopped in the street yet and asked for autographs?
No, not stopped in the street yet. Just abusive YouTube messages has been the major impact on my life in terms of the general public. It's been great fun, but as yet, stardom still is quite evasive.
Yeah, well, I think if you get abusive YouTube comments, you've made it. I think that's in our world, that's what you expect.
I don't get nearly as many as AK, so I think he must be very successful on that basis. Yeah.
I'm sure. So obviously we're going to get into legal topics today, and a caveat before we do start getting into them that although we're going to discuss many of these options, this is not to be taken as legal advice. So if you do need specific legal advice, go seek out somebody who could be your representative. But having that there, I want to first ask you about what the current situation is in 2025 for people who bet. Are you seeing a continued increase in matters such as disputes, complaints with firms that are coming across your desk?
I'm not seeing much in the way of litigation, to be honest with you, in the world of gambling. And I think there are a few reasons for that. It's harder to get into a situation nowadays where you actually have a dispute with a regulated bookmaker, which is worth litigating over, because, of course, people just don't seem to be winning large sums of money or being able to get large sums of money into their accounts or staked. The growth of the black market, which I'm sure we'll come on to, means that most people, an awful lot of people who do have disputes don't have them with regulated operators. And of course, it's almost impossible to, if not actually impossible, to get money out of black market operators. And although I've never been very mad keen on gambling harm cases, I think that the case last year, Gibson and Betfair, where the claimant was looking to recover £1.4 million of losses, saying that Betfair had not done enough to stop him incurring those losses, and he had gambling harm issues, which Betfair should have spotted, was his case. And the High Court reiterated really the judgment in Calvert and William Hill, which basically said that bookmakers don't have a broad duty of care to gamblers or their customers to protect them from their own gambling harm issues, their own problem gambling issues. And that's not really changed the law, because that was already the law in Calvert and William Hill. But what it has done is reiterated that after, a good 20 years, that is the case. And basically, as I've always said, unless you have told the bookmaker or given them very good reason to think that you have a gambling problem, the courts are not going to hold them responsible for your losses. So I think those three things, really, what is broadly known as affordability checks, although we're not really supposed to call them that, apparently,
no.
The growth of the black market and, the reiteration that gambling harm cases are very hard to bring, means that I'm seeing a lot fewer cases against bookmakers. I mean, that's anecdotal, of course. There are other lawyers maybe seeing more. That's not quite the same thing as saying that there aren't as many disputes. In a way, I think there are more disputes, because as the regulatory net gets bigger and also tightens, you're giving customers far more things to complain about in terms of the way they're treated by operators. So I think that there's an awful lot more complaints being made by customers to operators about things like, well, actually, why did you allow me to lose that money? Not that I have a gambling problem, but I couldn't afford to lose that money. And you should have known that, because they're reading in the press about things called affordability checks. So I think that you're moving in two directions, really. I think at the top level of big disputes, that seems to me to be slowing. And at the bottom of level of just sort of customer service complaints, that appears to be really quite relatively explosive, actually, in the last year or two, of operators dealing with those kind of complaints. In my experience and experiences of the people I've been working for, I don't have statistics sort of going across the industry on these things. I'm not sure that anyone does. But yes, we're in an odd place, I think, at the moment.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's often like complaints about live chat and trying to get answers to questions and having an inability to access funds or whatever it might be. It's generally perhaps not issues that you might take to someone like you for a case particularly, but it's just a frustration and maybe where the ombudsman fills the gap.
Yes, well, we'll come on to an ombudsman, I think. But yes, exactly. That is an obvious gap for an ombudsman. One of the huge frustrations of dealing with the Gambling Commission for many years has always been that it makes this strange distinction between customer service issues and regulatory issues. And given that what they regulate is a customer service industry, it strikes me as utterly bizarre to make that distinction that, we're not getting involved in that because it's customer service. And I think that's not helpful to either side of it, because it means that bookmakers don't really understand what's required of them, and customers are frustrated because they don't really understand what their rights are. And so you just end up in this quagmire of argument, really.
Exactly. And I think it's almost, when you think of the Gambling Commission, maybe a few years ago, people wouldn't be able to name anybody that works for the Gambling Commission. But more recently, they've had front page headlines about who runs it and front and centre in terms of some of the big debates. And punters are more and more aware of regulatory and legal issues because they're impacted by them so keenly at the moment.
I think that's right. And I think that the life cycle of the Gambling Commission is now getting into a place where it's perhaps more confident and they are going out more assertively than they were. I think one of the things we spoke about last time we spoke was that they were very unaccountable and they were hard to sort of get any kind of grip on when you wanted to deal with them. That seems to have changed somewhat into, they're popping up everywhere. They're now in the mainstream news quite often. They're currently at the forefront of charging these 15 people who are involved in the election date betting.
Yeah.
They were at the forefront of charging those darts players a few months ago who were banned, I think, for 8 years. Again, I'm aware that they are looking for the first time in a long time at issues in horse racing, potentially the first time ever, actually, in the case of the Gambling Commission. So in other words, it's not being left to the BHA. The Gambling Commission have decided to get involved. They are getting more assertive, I think.
Interesting. Well, that's the state of play as we are right now in terms of how it is. I think when we did the first podcast, I asked you a similar question, and it's certainly changed a little bit since then. But let's get into some of the questions that have come in, because this is obviously, in terms of betting disputes, I've had 2 similar questions. And first one's from Johnny, who asks, can bookmakers withhold and keep your deposits and winnings if you don't supply selfies of multiple documents months after your account was verified? And Ivor asked something similar. If I have a balance and I'm asked for documents, if I refuse to give them, am I still entitled to withdraw my balance, albeit I have forfeited the right to bet further with the bookmaker? What's the situation when it comes to this whole verification and of accounts when it comes to dealing with bookmakers?
Well, I mean, I'm going to caveat this by saying that Johnny has identified a huge problem with the industry generally, and one that an awful lot of people don't know the answer to, including, I would suggest gently, the Gambling Commission itself. This is a much more complicated issue than it ought to be. The starting point is that the Commission's guidance is that operators can't confiscate customer funds solely because they have failed to comply with identity and or age verification requirements. And it's also the case that the Commission says that an operator can't ask for information on withdrawal if it could reasonably have been supplied earlier. Which is great. And so far, that sounds very punter-friendly as far as it goes, and very clear to operators, because actually those two are the sides of the same coin, punter-friendly and clear to operators and helpful to operators, that are actually very often the same thing. It's not the case that it's either sort of a rule is pro-punter or pro-operator. But where it gets more challenging is that further on in the guidance, it says that after 12 months, the operator can apply a reasonable periodic charge for maintaining an account in the absence of ID. So what on earth has gone on in that situation? So someone has sought to withdraw some money. The operator has potentially late in the day said, well, can I have some ID if you want to do that? And the person said, no, you're not having it. Now, really, is the money going to be sitting there with them for 12 months? And should they really be charging after 12 months? It just seems a very strange scenario, particularly when the next element of the rule is that what they're supposed to do is that if they can't verify, they're supposed to do their best to return what's called the deposit balance using the last payment method used. And you sort of think, well, wait a minute, can that be right? Because really, when you're dealing with punters, the only money that could be the proceeds of crime is their money. It's their deposits. It's not going to be any winnings because that comes from the operator. What on earth is the point? So someone asks you for ID, the operator asks you for ID, you don't provide it, and then after a certain period of time, they're required to try and return you your deposits anyway. And you sort of think, well, why do they need to ask for ID in the first place? If presumably this was an anti-money laundering, okay, it could also be an age verification, responsible gambling issue. But it does rather beg the question that if someone is withdraw, they're asked for their ID, they don't give it, why do you only return the deposit and not any winnings?
Where do the winnings go? Are they donated to charity, or does the bookmaker just pocket them?
They're not supposed to pocket it. They're not supposed to. What they're able to do is charge this fee on an account over time. Now, the rules are vague enough that that's perhaps what some operators are doing, is they will return a deposit and then they will say, right, well, that will sit there while we take the winnings will sit there while we take 5% a year until it's gone. I don't know if that's what they're doing. But the more interesting element of this for me is, well, imagine a scenario where you can see how this might work if someone's just gone quiet. If they've put in a request for a withdrawal, perhaps they haven't put in a request for withdrawal and there's 50 quid in the account and they can't get rid of it. So they go, all right, well, we'll try and return it to the bank account. And if we can't, we charge 5 quid a year on this until it's gone. That seems to me relatively fair if you really just cannot get hold of the person using the ID, using the contact details they've got you. But imagine a scenario where you've got someone who has said, well, no, wait a minute, I know that you're not supposed to ask me for information that you could have asked earlier, so I'm not providing it to you. And they go, no, you've got to provide it to us. The Gambling Commission are not going to get involved in that. They're not going to resolve that because it's a customer. They might sort of use it against the operator down the line if it was reported to the Gambling Commission, but they're never going to get involved to sort that out and go, actually, you don't need to give them ID, or you do. You should have asked them, or you shouldn't. So you're in a complete Mexican standoff there, where you've got a guy going, no, I gave you my driving license, passport, whatever at the beginning. That was 3 years ago. You should have asked me for this, 6 months ago if you thought it was necessary. You can't just do it on withdrawal. They've done it anyway, which puts them in a slightly difficult position, because how rarely do you back down where you've said, I've got a regulatory duty to ask you for this information? It's very difficult to do that. So again, I just think the guidance leaves everything quite messy on this, which is a long way of saying to Johnny's question that I'm afraid the answer remains not terribly clear cut. I think the Commission has made efforts to try and deal with it since we last spoke, but I still don't think it's clear enough. And I also don't think it's clear enough when operators should be making suspicious activity reports to the National Crime Agency, because there's a huge overlap here. If someone refuses to identify themselves, imagine you're sitting on, I don't know, for whatever reason, you suddenly realize you forgot to ask for a passport at the beginning of the relationship, and you've got £150,000 in the account, and the guy's been putting in, quite a lot of that himself. If he suddenly goes, I'm not going to give you that, the answer is not just to wait 12 months, taking 5% out every year thereafter. You've got to make a suspicious activity report to the police. And again, I'm not sure it's completely clear from the guidance when that line is crossed. And as we'll come on to, I'm sure, and as anyone who's listened to our podcast will know, one of the huge frustrations for everyone in gambling is that the rules are just not prescriptive enough. And it's too much of the Gambling Commission telling you after the event that you got it wrong, rather than telling you in the first place how to get it right.
Oh, there's so much that, and I think there's quite a lot of punters who fall into this scenario where they don't wish to provide the information, and the bookmaker says, "Well, you can't have the funds until you do." And then they query, "Where do I go from here? The sum of money might not be big enough to take it to a lawyer or to worry about." And then obviously you've got to concern yourself with costs and everything like that.
But that's the thing. I mean, the difficulty is, let's say it was £500,000 and you go, right, I'm going to go and instruct a lawyer and we'll go to court. You've got to put yourself into the position of a judge in those situations. A judge who's not going to be used to the way the gambling industry works.
Yeah.
And he's just going to think to himself, why on earth does this lunatic refuse to give his driving license? And we've come all the way to court to do this.
Yeah.
That's what he's going to think. Because in every other industry, that's what you do. You are asked for anti-money laundering information and you provide it because it's necessary. A judge is never going to realize, or it's very unlikely to realize, that actually that's far more complicated in the gambling industry, and that there's this culture of people being worried that they're being only asked for this information on withdrawal because the operator is looking for reasons not to pay out. So imagine presenting yourself after sort of 14 months of litigation to a high court judge, and he just goes, sorry, is this all about a chap who's refusing to hand his driving license over to the operator?
Yeah.
He is going to think that person's a nutcase, but that's the problem.
Yeah. Even the idea of taking 5% to hold someone's money seems, you said it's fair. I'm thinking, no, you should be paying the other person 5%, but maybe there are costs for the maintaining the account, but
I suppose what I mean is in circumstances where this is essentially a dead account,
right.
is what I meant. I think is what I was really referring to, where you've got to do something with that money, because otherwise you're going to have to account for it somehow, and every year in perpetuity, and that alone will cause accountancy issues. So you've at a certain point sort of got to get rid of it. So you might be right. The answer might be, and the answer might well be, that what the Gambling Commission should do is say that at a point where you realize that you are going to have to take some of this money, you've got to donate it to a registered charity. That might improve the relationship between punters and bookmakers no end. It still doesn't, of course, get you around the difficulty of when that should happen. And the problem that bookmakers would have with that as well. What we don't want to be in is a scenario where we've donated money to charity and that we're then being sued by the customer who's saying that we did it too early or without good reason.
Well, I could just imagine the rules, something like you've got to wait a year to donate it, and then it would be the very last day when...
yeah, exactly. That you'd get a dodgy photocopy of the driving license that didn't quite give the date of birth, and then you wouldn't hear from them again for 6 months, and you'd be in a very nervous place. So I'm very critical, obviously, of the Gambling Commission, but there are a lot of the problems do not have obvious answers, and I do concede that. That's not the same thing as meaning that you don't really address the problems, which I think sometimes does happen a bit too much. But a lot of these problems are difficult because we discussed this last time. It's a very rare relationship, the bookmaker and customer, because it's completely adversarial. It's zero sum. There is no scenario where both sides come out of it feeling that they've achieved something together. That just doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's true. And I think this is where the issues lie, and we'll probably talk about ombudsman a bit later, but that is absolutely the type of scenario where they need to get involved, because the Gambling Commission don't seem to get involved in these kind of situations. And invariably, we talked there about someone with $500,000, but it's probably generally people who've got £150 or £500 or those kind of sums of money where it's ideal to get it back, but it's not something they're going to really spend lots of hours or engaging in IBAS or whoever.
That's right. And you wonder, really, if you're one of these absolute mega operators, do you really want lots of accounts with 40 quid hanging around the place? No, you don't. They're more of a headache than they are to have. And I think you put your finger on it. As I increasingly work for independent bookmakers, it is those small accounts that actually seriously punch above their weight in terms of the problems they create for everyone.
Yeah. Well, credit to Paddy Power, because they emailed me 2 weeks ago saying I had £60 in an account I've not used for 2 years. So the £60 I'd forgotten about. So
very good.
They did that exactly, and I was like, great, I'm going to withdraw that. I had no idea. So from a long unusable account.
There you go. Did you have to cough up your passport?
I think I had to redo everything, yes, but it was worth it.
Yeah.
And obviously it got through.
Well, this is the other reality of it, is that and one of the things that we have to accept in this is that the realities of bookmaking are quite tough and unusual. Very often, customers, as we've discussed, and for good reason, don't want to give ID to bookmakers and just won't do it. And for reasons that are beyond me, bookmakers are able to take money and take bets while they're still waiting for ID. And I think that's part of the problem. And that should just be kiboshed across the industry. You cannot place a bet until all ID requirements are met. What then happens is you've got a customer, it might become quite an important customer, and you ask them for some ID and they go, well, no, I'm not giving that to you. I'm going, or they obfuscate and delay, or, oh, so-and-so, whatever bet, don't ask me for that. So you carry on, and you shouldn't. You should be asking, of course, at that point for ID and saying, no, I'm putting my foot down, with the account suspended until you come back to me. But you know that what happens there is they go to other operators who aren't taking that approach, who are being more flexible. You put yourself at a vast disadvantage competitively immediately by saying, okay, we're going to follow the letter of the law here and just say, no, you've got to give it to us. What those operators then end up in the position of doing is going, well, we've got to get ID off this guy. He's now withdrawing. Maybe this is the time to do it because it's the only way we're going to get the ID off him and, have it on our records. I think actually that's quite often what goes on. So while it's certainly true that there's a lot of after timing and, I want to know a bit more about this chap and I'm annoyed that he's won this money from operators, there is also an element of, that is one of the only times on which bookmakers actually have a kind of leverage over the customer to actually provide the information, because otherwise they won't pay out.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I think at the moment you can verify you through the electoral roll, and then you can bet without needing to provide, to a certain level, without needing to provide that extra documentation.
I think it's to a certain level. And one of the complexities of all regulatory compliance issues is that, and we have this, all regulated industries have this, lawyers, I mean by we, have this, which is it's an ongoing obligation. You can't just say, I got that guy's passport 2 years ago and his KY, and his phone bill or water bill or whatever it is, and that's fine. It doesn't work like that. You do have to keep an eye on these things, and it does have to change. You do have to do things over time. We have deadlines over certain points over which, we have to ask clients who we've had for years to refresh to send us their passports again. And the same thing it happens for bookmakers as well. And so it does lend itself, unfortunately, to as I use the word quagmire again, to a bit of a quagmire, because again, and I go back to this problem of, these are two parties who don't have any interests in common with one another. They are adversaries.
Yeah.
And that's a very difficult relationship in which to throw the compliance regulation, which says you need to make sure that you're getting enough ID off this person, when that ID can also be used in certain circumstances to wriggle out of paying out. It's just a very difficult scenario.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, it's a thorny topic and one that will continue to be debated, but it's good to get the sense of somewhat what's happening there and how it works. And I was going to pivot to another question, one of similar lines, but this is from Rowley Burke in QC, who you might remember from the Fast Show.
I do. Yes.
He asked, is a bookie allowed to block winning bets placed in a shop until you have provided them with ID? And there has been some Twitter threads and topics about this lately, and I think you've talked about them. But from a shop perspective, how does that all work?
I'm not convinced that there's much of a difference between a shop, the rules on a shop, and the rules of online betting. Now, the starting point of the shop betting is that the rules that apply are the shop rules, which are are supposed to be certainly up somewhere in the shop. So it's very different. You don't click anything to say, I've agreed terms and conditions. But as long as the rules are relatively prominently displayed and they're not in absolutely microscopic type, and they comply with various other rules of contractual construction, it will be taken as read by a court that you had read the shop rules when you came in and before you placed your bet. Now, of course, no one does that, but that's not the same. It's the same way that no one reads through all the terms and conditions, because it's just human nature that they don't. I think there is perhaps somewhat of an urban myth that betting shops are being left behind or are still an outpost of a kind of older approach to regulation, where you can sort of go in, place a bet, and get on bets that you wouldn't be ID'd for. And the reason I say it's an urban myth, but it does happen. I think the truth is that actually you can get bets on much more easily in betting shops than you can online up to certain figures. And the figures, there is no published figure. It's all to do. And the reason for that, you never publish figures for threshold checks in the world of compliance, because you don't want people to know what they are, because then they would just do everything just under that threshold. We have ended up, I think, with a scenario where it is easier to get bets on in betting shops, but that's not, of course, to say that betting shops don't know who they're dealing with. We all know they do know very well who they're dealing with, but they know who they're dealing with for the most part for commercial purposes. So they will not have ID'd a lot of people, but they will know them very well, including in written records, in my experience, as people call things like, Wayne Rooney lookalike or Tesco's plastic bag man. And they will be keeping a very close eye on them. And not just for commercial purposes. They will say, oh, Wayne Rooney lookalike's been in an awful lot more recently and has been staking an awful lot more. And some of them will quite rightly say, take him aside and say, is everything all right? So it's not completely commercial. But broadly speaking, betting shops are supposed to have a very good handle on who is placing bets with them. And I think the best illustration of this was the Corbett bet fine from perhaps 6 months ago by the Gambling Commission.
Yeah.
Where they made it very clear that failure to interact with their customers, and ID them and know who they are, because of course you can't really interact with someone unless you've got some concept of who they are, because otherwise you don't know who they are next time they came in. But a lot of the difficulties that were found in the case of Corbett Bet, the Gambling Commission fined Corbett 686,000 for things like failing to identify a consumer who staked 23,000 in a 13-day period, failing to adequately interact with a consumer who staked 47,000 and lost 6,700. I mean, before we get on to the fact that these seem relatively paltry winnings, it doesn't address the question of whether the stakes were rolled over winnings. It just, we just don't know. But the point is that failures to get sufficient know your customer evidence or being able to verify the source of funds due to the high financial thresholds in place, that's all linked to failure to ID. So I think that really probably there are a lot of betting shops who are more relaxed than they necessarily should be, is what I suppose I'm saying. And that I think that there's the general consensus, which is that betting shops are an easier way to get on. And the reason for that is obviously because it's face-to-face, basically. And so people just sort of think, well, the risks aren't the same. And I think that's fair enough in terms of the analysis. I think you can take into account in your own policies when you're dealing with someone on a face-to-face basis that there probably is less inherent risk than when you're dealing with someone who might be living on the side of the world and you only interact with online. But ultimately, I think perhaps betting shops have got a bit complacent about this, and that they might find that a few of them are in for a rude awakening on the basis of the Corbett bet fine.
So back to the actual question, the specific monetary figure would be work it out per shop. They're not going to publish it. It's kind of information that you'll need to gauge from using the shop betting within it.
Yeah, and I suspect it'll change because for the same reason is that they don't want people knowing what the threshold is because it's then too easy to manipulate.
Yes.
But one of the interesting things about the Corbett bet fine, I mean, we use interesting in inverted commas, was that it included a failure to set appropriate thresholds.
Right.
So again, this is the Gambling Commission telling you afterwards that they're not high enough, but not telling you what to do beforehand. Now, there's a good reason, as I explain, why you don't set a figure. But then, it is quite hard to know. And, does it matter if you're on a Glaswegian council estate as against in Mayfair?
Yeah.
In terms of the thresholds, you said, I don't know. I don't think there's any guidance on that.
And that's part of the issue that many operators have is knowing where to set that guideline, what thresholds to set, and goes back to some of the frustrations that people have with financial risk checks, whatever the name they give to them, the affordability checks and how they can vary based on that. Okay, so that's online and ID on shops. Sorry, and there's another question which is kind of two in one. The first one's almost about account security. It was an email I was sent from Steve, who told me within the last year, a friend had all bar one of his betting accounts emptied. He doesn't know how it happened, as none of the bookmakers were forthcoming, but he thinks it may have been compromised. He said, without exception, the customer service from the bookies was woeful, and he had varying success getting his money back. So that's kind of a question on account security. But then he pivots and says the UK-based ones all paid him back eventually, but he was ignored by those based overseas, e.g. in Gibraltar. And that is the second part of the question, because I know that's a point that we're going to get into here. And as they were for relatively small sums, he basically wrote them off. So 2 points to this question. In terms of account security and these issues, do you see many of those type of things rearing their heads? And also the differences with operators based in the UK and those based out of Gibraltar?
I don't think I've seen any relating to breaches of account security, actually. It's one of the... I'm quite surprised in a way that there hasn't been someone who has at least tried that, frankly, on to get their money back. Not remotely suggesting that's what's going on here, of course, but no, I'm not. So I can't tell you much about that. The Gibraltar one is an interesting one. For me, for many years, been a bugbear that operators are not required to have an address in the United Kingdom at which they can be essentially sued, where you can serve a claim form on them. There are very, very strict rules about bringing claims in this jurisdiction. And one of them is that you have to show good service. And that's not the same as just showing that someone knows that they have it. You've got to do proper service under the CPR. And it's very difficult to do if people aren't based here and don't have a presence here. I'm aware of a chap who spent 2.5 years trying to serve papers in, I think it was Malta.
Wow.
Because you have to do it, in his case, he had to do it through the Foreign Process Office, which then goes out to some office in Malta that then goes and finds some kind of court officer, then has to go and find an address. Another very frustrating element of this is the addresses of bookmakers are not always quite as clear as they should be, including on the Gambling Commission's register. And basically, this court bailiff in Malta was saying, I can't find them. I think that's them, but I can't find them. And this went on for 2.5. And eventually he had to get an order, I think, that said that address was good enough. But it took him either 2 or 2.5 years just to serve the claim form. And if they had a presence in the UK, it would have taken, you can send it in a first-class post. So I suspect that might be at the bottom of the difference in attitude, which is that the ones in Gibraltar know it can be very, very difficult to get at them. Whereas the ones who have an address here know that you can issue a claim in the small claims court like that.
So that's absolutely something that needs addressing by, I presume, the Gambling Commission.
I think it really does. I don't understand. I suspect that if it's been brought up, I suspect that the ones who don't want to do it say, oh, well, no, we don't want a tax presence in the UK. But an address for service is not a tax by any stretch going to be considered to be a tax presence. So I think that's something that could really help to clear up the commission, that the industry generally is that those ones who are based offshore, and particularly when they're presenting themselves as very, very much British brands, I think it is relatively scandalous that they're able to sort of disappear off into the ether and be that much more difficult to sue. And you do wonder really what the point of a regulator is if they allow that kind of situation to have arisen and not to have addressed it for so long.
Definitely a simple thing to fix in many ways. That could make a big difference. So briefly on this one, because we're going to move on to like financial checks and other questions, we referenced an ombudsman, and that I believe is still on the agenda. And I think it's taken, as things do seem to take a long time in this world to anything to come to fruition. What would you like to see? An independent ombudsman, I'm sure, but how would you improve things?
So I'm not a big fan of ombudsmen, as I've made relatively clear over the years, because I think that they can be enormously frustrating for everyone, really. And what you end up with is another situation where everyone just doesn't trust them to come up with good decisions. Ombudsmen tend not to traditionally apply the law. And so the point of the law generally is that people have certainty as to outcome. And what you have with ombudsman is an assessment on the basis of consumer fairness. So you end up with people who have very little legal training looking at a scenario and going, oh, I don't think that's fair, or I think that is fair. And so I'm going to come up with this kind of decision based on my own subjective views of what is fair. Why I think that's particularly worrying in gambling is because it's such a high level of understanding is required before you can even begin to make decisions on the basis, but make an assessment of what's moral or what's fair. So I suspect that people will find a gambling ombudsman, very, very frustrating, unfortunately. But I think that an ombudsman is better than no ombudsman. I think that the difficulty will be that it's going to have to deal with relatively low level disputes over those ones over tenors, 20 quid, 50 quid. But it would be very helpful. Are they going to be able to deal with ID things? I'm not sure they are, because that's technically those obligations are put on operators by the Proceeds of Crime Act. I'm not sure ombudsmen are going to want to get weighing in on whether a driving license is required or not. So I don't think they'll be doing that. So that means I think they won't be able to clear up a lot of those messes that we might hope they clear up, because it's just going to be above their pay grade. So I think it will be a sort of version of what used to be called the petty courts, which is just petty disputes, small, petty meaning small, rather than, I'm not making any judgment over whether they should be brought. And I think it will probably not be very different from IBAS. I'm sorry to say it. I just don't think it will.
So it might improve things slightly, but it won't fix the inherent problems we have.
I don't want to criticize something that hasn't started yet too much.
It's realistic.
But I do struggle to, because I've dealt with them across a number of industries, ombudsman. And the decisions you get, they're not dissimilar to the sort of, the IBAS ones that sort of get viral because they drive people completely insane. I haven't seen one for a while, and perhaps things have improved at IBAS. But you get the same thing, and it can take a very long time. And, I was involved in one in another industry where someone had just brought a completely scandalous complaint in order to try and avoid paying for something, basically. And it was for a professional services company who said, well, look, here's the evidence. You should throw this out because there's no grounds to it. And it was perfectly obvious there was no grounds to complain. There was documents that said there was no grounds to complain. And the ombudsman, they did eventually win, but the ombudsman refused to throw it out because they said, oh, yes, but the consumer feels that they have been let down. And so this has to progress. And he used to go, well, wait a minute. What is the purpose of having a strikeout process if all the consumer has to do is say, well, no, I still think that I have been wrong, regardless of all the evidence that I've been wronged, and this should proceed to a full adjudication? Who on earth would have brought a complaint in circumstances where they don't think they have been treated badly? And so that's the kind of frustration you get, the kind of frustrating approach you can get. It doesn't mean to say that all ombudsmen will behave in the same way at all. And maybe this will be much better. But as I've said before, there's not a vast difference between what IBAS does and what an ombudsman does.
There we go. IBAS, Ombudsman, that debate will roll on, but it's good to get that perspective on it and your experience. This podcast is sponsored by the Matchbook Betting Exchange. When it comes to betting exchanges, Matchbook has been my personal go-to for some time now. Using horse racing as an example, they've offered the best prices on the most runners this year, which can make a big difference to your bottom line. Plus, with an industry-leading score of 4.2 on Trustpilot, you know you're in safe hands. Download the Matchbook Betting Exchange app or go to matchbook.com today. And if you enter the code SBC150, that's SBC150 on sign up, you can get commission free for your first 150 days, which can give you even more value. If you need to place a larger or more bespoke bet, or are indeed a corporate or operator client, their brokerage service is excellent and available 365 days a year. For more details, email the team at brokerage@matchbook.com. Matchbook Betting Exchange is for bettors who know better. I want to pivot now to another hot topic and had quite a few questions on multi-accounting. Yes, we're going to talk about multi-accounting, bidding, noming, other names. It goes by a variety of different terms. But There's a few questions that came in. First one was from Liam, and he said, Harry made a point at last year's Smart Bash conference in relation to fraud by misrepresentation and comments made by Andrew Rhodes. I think there was a broader linkage of this to a criminal offence and bettors using other people's accounts. It may be worth asking him about punters' use of other accounts for getting on. And Anonymous asked a similar question, the legality of betting through bids.
Anonymous sounds like they might be quite nervous.
Yes, I think so, yeah. They weren't anonymous, but I made it anonymous upon their request. And he was also asking about what people can do to mitigate any legal issues. But let's get into the weeds on that one in terms of if you are opening accounts, whether it be in one person's or multiple people's names, how is that viewed?
This is a question of how far do you go back. You have to accept that the problem is created by the fact that bookmakers do not want to take bets off people who can make money. Yeah. And that creates the problem. You then have to consider what is the legitimate next step for the industry to take once people cannot get a bet on, basically. And it hasn't ever been answered, really. The exchanges were an answer to a point, but people who felt that was their outlet, I guess, are feeling much less that that's the case since the liquidity has started to drop in the exchanges, which means that they now feel
you can't replicate the same bets. You can't do each way bets. You can't do multiples. You can't do all.
Of course, no, you're exactly right. You don't have this sort of smorgasbord of offers, and absolutely right. But it was an outlet for those who, they might have perhaps to their chagrin, but it was an outlet, and that seems to be disappearing as well. There is a huge problem lurking over this industry, which is that what do you do about people who can make money?
Yeah,
I don't have the answer to that, and I'm not sure that anyone does. Anyway, what that caused, obviously, was people trying to get on bets in other people's names because they had been restricted in their own names. And they take the view, very understandably, that if bookmakers are offering odds, then they should accept bets. There is, of course, no minimum bet rule. And the Gambling Commission have said till they're blue in the face, there is no right to place a bet, and there's no obligation on bookmakers to accept any bet. So they can do that. They're allowed to. What then about multi-accounting? I started to say last year, because I can't tell you how many times I've heard from people saying, I think it's a grey area. And I sort of would go, well, I think it's slightly dangerous to assume that's a grey area. I think it possibly isn't a grey area. And I'm increasingly of the view that it is not a grey area. I think that it depends how you do it. I think that so much of it is going to be context-based in this assessment. So if you're two young men who've set up accounts perhaps at the same time and both were using each other's from time to time, one gets shut down and they use the other one for 6 weeks till that gets shut down, I think it would be very hard to say that that was a criminal offence. It might be a breach of the terms and conditions. But on the other hand, I think you have people who are doing things on a much more industrial scale, where they are looking to pull the wool over the eyes of bookmakers as to who's placing the bet in a major way. And ultimately, you're just not allowed to do it. Whether you agree with it or sort of the morals of it, you aren't allowed to do it. And I fear that we will start to see more people being charged with offences relating to the use of accounting for fraud by false representation, the false representation being that you are the person placing bets rather than someone who is a much more talented punter. And it's particularly bad if that punter has been warned off by that particular bookmaker. I've been saying for a very long time people shouldn't do it. There has come into the sort of the midst of all this a sort of hybrid problem which is called a civil forfeiture application under the Proceeds of Crime Act 2002. And I'm seeing increasing numbers of these, which is when the police or the National Crime Agency make an application under the Proceeds of Crime Act for what's called for a civil restraint order. It's not a criminal prosecution. They don't have to bring a criminal prosecution with it. Effectively, what they do is they make an application to a civil court and they say, this is what we have been told by the operator or the bank who's been involved in the transactions. We think that there is enough here to show that this money could be, on the balance of probabilities, not the criminal standard, which is beyond all reasonable doubt, the balance of probabilities, 50-50, we think this could be the proceeds of crime. What almost always happens is that that money gets frozen because the courts are very quick to freeze it. It then becomes for the account holder to prove, again on the balance of probabilities, that the money is not connected with criminality, not for the court, not for the police or the National Crime Agency to prove that it was. If you're unable to do that or you're nervous about doing it, the money's gone. Just it's taken by the Crown. Very often is not followed by any criminal charges. Far more often than not followed by criminal charges. In fact, the policy of a number of police forces and other organisations, published policy, is that when they've got this money, they take the view that unless it's very serious, they're not going to press charges. So to make this even more complicated, what often these investigations, is the organisation thinking that what they're looking at is money laundering because they're seeing money moving between bank accounts, betting accounts, and they just think, well, people who don't know the first thing about betting just think, why are there so many transactions? That can't be right. Now, I'm aware of occasions where people involved in betting have explained to the relevant police force, oh no, this is how I make money. This is the only way I can make money. I place bets. And they go, okay, great. Okay, well, we thought it was money laundering. Fine, off you go. And they'll drop the proceedings. Others go, well, you're defrauding bookmakers. And it just depends what police force you've got at the moment as to what approach they take. Yeah. It is a very, very strange scenario. And some of the arguments that are put forward by some of the police forces, that, as you can imagine, as to why certain why certain funds might be attached to the proceeds of crime are bizarre. Because, of course, they don't know the first thing about gambling. But imagine the nervousness of someone who is being pursued by the police in those circumstances. It's very easy just to say, do you know what, keep it. I don't want to get involved in this. And most of that comes from, multi-accounting, because it's transactions which trigger the interests of the National Crime Agency or the police. So don't do it. I say don't do it. But, of course, the other difficulty you have with is it is at least not the black market. Because, of course, the next step, what can you say to someone who can't get a bet on with a traditional bookmaker, can't get a bet on because they're worried about criminality of doing it through someone else? And for the reasons we've discussed, the exchanges aren't going to sort them out. Well, the obvious place for them to go now is the black market, isn't it?
Yes. Which
is a huge problem.
As there's no solution to the problem, the money goes somewhere. There'll be those people willing to go, okay, it's too risky this, so I'm going to take this approach. And
it is amazing to me that more thought has not gone into how do we deal with winning punters across the industry. It seems to operate on the basis that they can just be blocked, obscured, knocked, ignored, and just not allowed into the party, basically. And I'm not sure that is very good for the longevity of the game myself, but there we go.
We're going to go somewhere. Some people obviously give up, but quite a few people are still incentivized due to the amount of money they can make or just their enjoyment of this to continue to find a route, whether that be...
That's right.
Potentially risky in terms of criminality or... I mean, it sounds like from what you're saying, there's not been any prosecutions yet, but they may be forthcoming for those people who go to the wrong police force and say, oh, it's just me betting in someone else's name and thinking they're just going to maybe at worst lose the money, but potentially they could be prosecuted.
They could potentially be, in most cases, that is the worst that happens, as the money goes. But if you go to an interview with the police, the interview, to explain it, the interview could be used against you in the criminal prosecution thereafter. So it's a dangerous game if you're a bit worried about and you're not quite sure whether what you are doing is legitimate. But it's a bit of a mess at the moment. And I think a lot of it would be cleaned up if there was some way, and again, I don't say there's an easy answer to this. Obviously, a lot of people are sent to the black market by affordability checks and various other things. I think we're going to come on to the black market, so I won't preempt that now. But as multi-accounting becomes more dangerous, somewhat ironically, what it does is it kind of almost increases criminality by not that the people who bet with the black market, but the black market operators themselves very often criminals. You're sending money to criminals. It's a very strange irony.
And this is very much UK specific, because I imagine people will be listening to this once it goes out, because it's quite compelling content that we don't really hear in terms of the legality of multi-accounting. I presume this is mainly UK based, but I presume other jurisdictions will be looking at this at the same point. Or are you aware of how it's being viewed elsewhere?
I'm not. No, I'm very parochial, I'm afraid, in my understanding of these things, and I keep it very much UK. We are a very highly regulated jurisdiction for gambling. Even Ireland is, I think it's catching up with, I say catching up, I don't mean that in a derogatory way at all. I'm not sure that we want to be, that anyone should be catching up with some of the problems that we've got. But Ireland has traditionally been a much more loosely regulated gambling market. But no, I don't really know what the rules on third-party accounting are in other jurisdictions. I think, again, I suspect we're at the forefront of that, but I may be wrong.
Yeah, well, often the UK has led the way in terms of the betting world. We see, the big British operators going into other countries where they loosen regulation or they open up, like across America, for example, the Bet365s and these kind of companies, and making a big splash. So I was also, to wrap up this chat on multi-accounting, in terms of shop betting, we talked about that before, how are runners viewed? A runner would be, let's say I employ somebody, or you say to you, Harry, here's my bets, go and place them in the shop because I can't get down or I'm not able to access them. How are they viewed in terms of this?
I think the way to put that is, if you were under cross-examination, what is the question that the Crown would put to you? Why did you send that person to that shop to place the bet for you? And if your answer to that is because I knew that they wouldn't take that bet from me, so I wanted them to think it was being placed by someone else, you're back into the realms of potential fraud offences. So I don't see that it's any really very different to anything online.
Oh, so it's a good point. So bear that in mind. So yeah, if it's just because you can't get in, or maybe you don't live there, or you overseas potentially. But
yeah, there are plenty of legitimate reasons to send someone for a bet. But if you're sending 50 people, it's so difficult, isn't it? Because, it's been romanticized and people have written books about Barney Curley doing that. And so everyone thinks that's a perfectly normal thing to do and a perfectly acceptable thing and a romantic thing and a clever thing to do. But actually, in this day and age, it's a very dangerous thing to do, in my view.
Yeah, really interesting stuff there, Harry. Thanks a lot. That's I'm sure that'll be listened to by many people to weigh up the pros and cons of if they should do that. And I also want to briefly, before we get onto the black market, talk about that topic of restrictions and closures of winning accounts. I think surprisingly didn't get any questions on this, because normally I get like a question a week. I think it's been, everyone kind of knows, but I want to get your point on it. The legal standing on account closures, like you said, like why do they happen? There's been no solution to that. I think we're going to close punters down and who cares what happens to them. But in terms of something simpler like the advertising of them, you see bookmakers promoting, say, oh, you can beat us. And, there are adverts on TV I can think of at the moment, which are talking about or showcasing somebody having an edge or being successful with their betting, beating the bookmaker. But yet when you do bet with them, is that not misleading advertising? Could that not be construed in that way?
So I'm not a sort of advertising standards lawyer by any stretch. What I can tell you is that there in many ways, these sort of origins, or the origin story of modern contract law, is based on the difference between advertising offers and what we call invitations to treat. An advert is never an offer to a consumer which can be accepted. It's what's called an invitation to treat. In other words, it's an offer for you to come and talk about doing a deal. And so ultimately, what matters is the term, from a contract law point of view, is what's in the terms and conditions and how those are interpreted by statute and case law. There are sort of famous cases of, do you remember I think they made a Netflix documentary about it in America, of the chap who bought all those Pepsi bottles because he said that after they did an advert that said after you got a certain number, you could get an RAF or you could get a fighter jet. That was a famous American case on exactly this point, as far as I can remember. But ultimately, the answer is no. Again, I'm ignoring advertising standards stuff here because I just don't know about it. But you can't say, oh, look, they gave the impression that I could make money over time. Therefore, that's a term of the contract because that's the basis upon which I entered it. I don't think you're ever going to be able to elevate an advert like that to what's called a representation. Which would be incorporated into the contract. So sadly not.
Okay. And has anyone taken a route to try and challenge their restriction, whether it be unfair trade or they're discriminatory? They'll take a bet from one person but not the other?
I've not heard of it done, and I suspect that no lawyer would really encourage anyone to do it. Again, I've not looked at the law on discrimination, but I would be surprised if you can force someone to do business with you outside of an employment context, force someone to do business with you when you're being discriminated against for having a commercial advantage over that person. I'd be pretty gobsmacked if there were any grounds to that. I know that's not going to come as very good news to a lot of people. I just go back to my point. Bookmakers don't have to take bets from people they don't want to. That sounds right in a way, because that's how it should operate across most industries. People shouldn't have to do business with people that they don't think they are going to make money out of. But the difficulty is, again, I'm sorry to repeat myself, but it's this adversarial relationship, because it operates totally differently. In most industries, people want to do business together because they'll both do well out of it. They'll grow. There'll be some sort of economic growth will come from it. They will make some wealth. And in bookmaking, it's just taking the other side's wealth. And so it would be lovely if we could find a way that entitles people who are good at betting to place bets, but it is a zero-sum game. Money goes into a pot and people try to take it out. The money doesn't go into a pot and then get bigger. That's ultimately the problem with gambling.
That's true. And again, it goes probably down to industry to come up with a solution. And there has been talk about things like minimum bet legislation. But when I spoke to Tom Waterhouse on an early AK Bets podcast, because they introduced that in Australia, he said one of the issues was it wasn't regular punters taking advantage of it. It was organised syndicates and groups and bots who they were able to get 250 Australian dollars on a bet, and they were just taking as many of those 250s across multiple accounts.
I listened to that, and I think Trench said a similar thing as well, didn't he? If I remember rightly, that it wouldn't work. And I've heard very clever people on both sides of that debate explaining why it would or wouldn't work. And I have to say, I find both sides equally confusing. But my instinct really is that people are so good at abusing these things. And I don't mean abusing in any kind of rude, there are such clever people out there in the punting world. It just instinctively feels like a license to cause more problems. That's my relatively uneducated view on that.
Yeah, it's a good point, and probably a topic for another debate, and for maybe more experienced betting minds than you and I in terms of that front. So
yeah, we could get sort of Chris Fawcett versus Waterhouse, and frankly, you get 3 days of content on this. I think
that's the next podcast episode done. Then let's get into the black market, because it's front and center these days. And why is it growing? What are the contributing factors as you see it? Is it mostly the affordability checks that we're seeing these days, or is it a mix of punters not able to get a bet on because they're restricted?
Ultimately, it's a creation of the internet. I mean, that's really what's caused the black market, is that you're able to access people all over the planet. Black market bookmakers in the old days were, almost sort of comical characters that sort of, might set up a stand in a East End boozer on Grand National Day or something. That was what people thought was a kind of black market bookmaker. They're now huge corporations, which are semi-legitimate, some of them in many jurisdictions, or perfectly legitimate in many jurisdictions. What's created the popularity of it here? Firstly, it's that question one, internet gives you access. Two, onboarding clients has become a pain in the neck for both operators and punters. But punters have the option of not doing it now that the black market exists, so they go there. Three, obviously, you've got the problem of people who have been restricted for very long. Forget before. It's all very well listening to bookmakers saying now, it's all the affordability checks. They've been pushing people out of the black market for years by not allowing them to get on. Let's just be straightforward about that. Not in the droves that they've been pushed by affordability checks. I'm talking about big court here. I'm not talking about your more reasonable operators by any stretch. And then the other thing that's happened is that because of the absence of regulatory and compliance costs, a lot of the black market will provide a better customer service than the licensed market. This is third party. This is coming from other people. I'm pleased to say, black market websites, but I do understand that they are offering better products, more interesting design of their websites, because they're able to. They don't have to spend money on, and it's extremely expensive. I suspect a lot of them aren't paying much tax, and they're certainly not paying for vast teams of compliance professionals. So I'm afraid that they're just more efficient, and that's another real problem, which is, when are you ever going to compete with the black market on the basis of efficiency? You can't. If you're going to be remotely regulated, and it has to be regulated gambling, you're never going to be able to compete with an unrestricted black market.
No, they've got a competitive advantage. And when it comes to the type, are you seeing any particular, from the insight that you have, is it Telegram, WhatsApp, or is it crypto bookmakers, some of the big operators that you've talked about, or is it a mix? I've seen some operators using Telegram, and it's phenomenal what they're doing through there and how they can you can use them to place bets
Yeah.
to get down. And it must be very difficult to manage and track.
Really difficult, I would have thought. And certainly they must have much more sophisticated kit than I have if they're able to do these things from WhatsApp. But obviously to punters, if a bookmaker's paying out, they don't really care if they're black or white market. That's just the reality of the situation. And very often, particularly if you're a punter who loses over time, you will probably feel that you're getting a really good service from a WhatsApp bookmaker that you're not getting from your account, which asks you to re-verify because you haven't logged in for 2 weeks, that kind of thing. And what I tend to see is a bit of a mixture. So we get a lot, and a lot of people, and I think it's desperately sad. And one of the things that the Gambling Commission really could be working on, I'm sure they are, but this really, for me, should be the main first step in properly fighting the black market, is to do more to make people aware that the black market exists and is a real problem, because it's amazing how many people think they have placed money with a licensed operator and haven't. That's the thing that I would be very worried about if I was the Gambling Commission, is that there's a lack of understanding that there's a difference. And so we get a lot of people go, oh, these people have behaved appallingly. And the first question is, well, are they licensed here? Oh, I don't know. They're called something. I'm sure, they came up really high on Google, that kind of thing. And then you look them up and they're a black market operator from they're sort of Satan bet from North Korea. There's nothing that can be done. That would be the first step, is to, whether it's to have a campaign aimed at punters to make them understand they've got to bet with licensed bookmakers if they want to have any of their legal rights. And of course, a lot of cynics might suggest, well, actually, if you're going to be based on the other side of the world and make it as difficult to get paid as possible, really, is there a difference between a black market and a white market operator anyway? But it is sad that people come to you and think, I've lost lots of money to these people over the years. I had a big win and they've closed my account down. What do I do? Obviously, I can sue them because they've behaved appallingly, and they can't. It's just very sad.
So almost a bit like an awareness campaign of some kind of logo or branding that says we are an authorized, regulated operator, and how important it is across the industry, whether it be the Gambling Commission, someone to lead it and say, make sure that who you bet with is a legitimate operator. Otherwise,
absolutely, yeah,
you might lose your money.
If you can do all these adverts, I don't approve of the thinking behind the adverts of having operators doing anti-money laundering adverts with their brand all over the advert as they do it. It's just a ridiculous way of doing it. That's not a criticism of the operators, it's a criticism of the whole industry thinking that's a sensible way of doing it. But if you can do that, if you can have adverts about, that look like a responsible gambling campaign, but in fact appear to be much more an advert for a bookmaker in question, why on earth can't we have campaigns that say, do not use black market bookmakers?
And how to spot one and how they operate.
Yeah, exactly. And the dangers and the threats and the dangers and the threats. And I said this on the last pod, and I am going to reiterate it, such as its importance. The worst thing you can do, no one must ever do, is get involved in credit betting with black market bookmakers, because of course they still allow it.
Yeah.
And in those circumstances, the people who are giving you the credit are likely to have very little recourse of getting it from you that involves lawyers. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I think we all know what you mean there. Yeah. Have you had cases or people any joy at all with or trying to enforce anything with some of these offshore operators, or even some of the what might be termed grey operators, or even black market ones? Has been much across your desk, or what's your experience been? Very negative, I assume.
I'm involved in litigation around the black market, certainly in this jurisdiction, not abroad, because I just think it would be too risky with a client's money to go looking for money out of some of the people based in these jurisdictions. You probably have to use their courts. You might be able to get a judgment here, but then God knows where you enforce it. Will they pay? I just think that trying to get money out of too many overseas black market operators would be a complete nightmare, frankly, and almost impossible. So the answer is no. But inevitably, because that's the way the market is moving, the gambling disputes I do now involve elements of what might be, equally what might not be, who knows, called black market betting.
Yeah, because obviously term black market, you look to America and they've got firms like Kalshi and obviously lots of legal challenges and Polymarket, where huge sums of money are flowing through them into things like political betting and even just traditional sports. Some of the handle, the turnover on some of these sports is out eclipsing some of the regulated firms. So it feels like it's growing and it continues to grow, but there's no handle on how to track it and how to govern that.
It's a very, very worrying, to being people on the bookmaking side of this, use the black market as a kind of threat against the world. Oh, well, if you continue to put restrictions on us, taxes or regulation, if you continue to do that, you're just going to make the black market grow. People need to be very careful of that, because the world is changing in its attitude towards gambling. The reason, in my view, that's happened is because of allowing people to, the casino in the pocket point, basically, of allowing people to have 24-hour access to online casinos. It's just totally changed the attitude of the public in this country to gambling. If the black market becomes uncontrollable, in my view, the answer will not be that society says, okay, we've got to deregulate gambling. It will be, we've got to ban gambling. And so the black market is not just a threat. It is to be used for non-regulation. It needs to be dealt with. And a lot of that is going to be getting much better at identifying black market operators, punishing them, and restricting people's access to them. That isn't working at the moment, as we all know. But I'm not sure people have necessarily understood what the potential end game here is. The black market could pull down with it all gambling.
There's existential there. And I would add into that as well, they need to make the more accessible in terms of the regulated market, easier and fairer and just better for consumers with less friction points, because they don't have that with the black market. You want to bet? Yeah. And maybe you don't even have to send money because you can bet on credit.
Absolutely.
Maybe you can send some kind of cryptocurrency. It's done instantly and there's no problems. There's no bank asking you questions. And there needs to be almost an update to the current situation to try and fight it on the same terms.
Making the regulated market a much better place to be a customer is a huge part of it, of course. But of course, I have to go back to our point that there will always have to be some regulation. And so the black market will always have a competitive advantage. And so you can't outmaneuver the regulated market cannot outmaneuver the black market. That's never going to happen.
No.
We've got to stamp on it.
Exactly. Okay. Well, that's the black market done and dusted, and I've kept you a good hour now, so I've got some closing questions, if that's okay, Harry. And the first one is about horse racing. I know that's a field of interest for you. It's from Liam, and he asked me, you frequently discuss the state of horse racing on the AK Bets podcast. I think if you were to ask what could be done to destroy horse racing, the answer could well be everything that the current authorities are doing at the moment. I wondered what Harry's views are, re what could be done to save horse racing.
That's not very fair, because my talent really is criticising horse racing, not coming up with solutions. I think it's got to be made an awful lot smaller. I don't think I'm unique in that. There's too much of it. Prize money is too diverted around just too many people chasing too little money. I think that would be a huge help. It'd be very sad, because it does mean a lot of the people at the bottom of the sport who really do love it and do it for the love would be jostled out of the professional game and would have to be doing it at best amateur or not at all. So it comes at a very serious social cost. But I think it's probably got to happen. I think that the sport needs to start selling itself in a much more positive way. I really think that welfare has, funny enough, in the same way that it's the same way that sort of gambling companies think now, is that they're almost ashamed from the marketing side of things to market what it is they do, because they think there are so many people out there who disapprove of what they do. But if you can't market what it is that you do, then you're in real trouble. And horse racing for too long, we did a thing on our podcast the other day about about the latest advert that's supposed to get people racing. And, it was all about sort of, the experience of being at the races with fun fairs and bands afterwards. But I was asked it yesterday, and it was just absolutely fantastic. And it's a event that really embraces what it is. It doesn't hide away. Ignoring the fact that it did, I think it was them that airbrushed a whip from pictures, so they're not complete saints. But I would like to see racing marketed on a national level, not on a course by course level. I think they've got to do things like make the experience much better at a lot of different race courses. Apparently, you could get in ask for £25, and that's to see about the best day's racing you could hope for. And yet, you can go to races all over the country where they're showing complete rubbish and pay 3 times that, or certainly double that, as an absolute minimum. So there are an awful lot of things to do. Funny enough, the other thing I would do would be to look into the bloodstock industry, because there is a ton of money around racing, and people very often say that that's associated with racing. And of course, some of it does bleed into racing, but as far as I can tell, whenever you see a bloodstock agent, most of it appears to be spent on very expensive Range Rovers. I don't think that an awful lot of the money in bloodstock is going into horse racing. I've made this point before, that if you're a bookmaker and you're being asked to contribute to a levy, because basically the principle is that, well, you're doing very well out of the existence of horse racing, so we want some of the money. I think you could start thinking about applying the same logic to the top end of bloodstock and going, well, if this horse is worth, 3 million quid, it's only worth 3 million quid because you can race it. And so if that kind of money is floating around and it has become so disassociated with the potential returns in terms of what the prize money is, you should be putting some of that money into prize money. I'm sure that would be a huge fight, but it would be one that I think might be worth it.
Well, let's hope Lord Allen's listening, because if he ever starts the BHA.
Yes, he's probably having more meetings with more stakeholders. He appears to have been doing that for a very long time.
Yeah, like an extensive gardening leave pre BHA. Well, I would also add into the mix there betting. Maybe do a little bit of betting content, or highlight the fact that you can enjoy betting at Ascot or many of the other ones around the country, and bring that into the discussion a little bit more, because I think that's what attracted a lot of people.
That's absolutely right. That's what I mean about the national. That would have to be a central part of the national advertising campaign. I mean, just very quickly, I went on a stag do arranged by me. We went to a box at Newmarket, 15 guys who didn't know anything about horse racing at all. And the thing that grabbed them from moment one was betting. And they absolutely loved it on every race. That is its major selling point. It has become more difficult to talk about betting because of slots. End of story, in my view. That it has poisoned the narrative. But we've got to try and wrest that narrative back. And I don't want to go off on this, but I think I broadly welcome the recent decision by the BHA to start, and others in racing, to start distancing themselves from, or at least distinguishing themselves from casino betting, because that's been a long time coming, in my view.
Yeah, I would second that as well. Okay, so that's to save horse racing. And David Johnson also asked on X, does Harry ever wish he worked in a different part of the legal world? And if he wasn't a lawyer, but still wanted to work in racing, what would he do? Jockey?
Yeah, well, I'm the right height, but probably not the right age or body mass index for a jockey. But no, I wouldn't want to do another area of the law. I worked out very early on that I like disputes, and those are what keep me interested. In horse racing, look, it's difficult to be too excited about a job in horse racing at the moment. I've got a hyphenated surname, so presumably I'd be a very good trainer. But I don't want to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning or say things like "holiday, what's a holiday?" every time someone mentions that they've gone to Spain. And what else is there? Funny enough, I suppose the marketing side, I probably, if I were to restart and not be a lawyer, I do think that the science of marketing and kind of mass, psychology and the way that people behave, all those people who, I can't remember his name, wrote that book, Thinking Fast and Slow. I think that's all very interesting. And
Daniel Kahneman, is it?
That's it, yeah. And of course, those are very applicable to punting as well, all those kind of, those sciences.
Oh yeah, very much so.
I think that would be a career I would probably quite enjoy. And, I suppose in horse racing, I've said enough about how they should market it. Perhaps what they should do is they should put me at the head of a national marketing campaign.
There you go. You heard it here first. Lord Allen.
There you go.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I'm surprised you didn't say pro punting, but I guess you've seen enough of what happens from that side. Yeah. So
I've also tried it and know that it's not going to work out.
Okay. And Harry, I've kept you a good hour and a quarter now, so it's only fair I give you an opportunity to sell yourself, if you like, to listeners. And there's a good question that came in from Liam again, who said, I'd also like to know more about instances where Harry could assist bettors. My sense is that it's like to be in the realm of a bigger payout, or where a bettor is facing challenges of obtaining a payout. But where is he most likely to be able to help people listening to your podcast? So go ahead and tell people what you might be able to do.
Well, he's quite right. The difficulty is that far too often I can't help, because the value of the dispute is just not high enough in punting. Really, most of the things I do are minimum 100,000 over the years. In terms of what I do now, I'm a broad commercial litigator. So I don't just do gambling disputes. I don't just do horse racing disputes. I do lots of contract disputes between companies. And I also do quite a lot of defamation. In terms of what you're punting, what I can help with people in punting, it continues to be disputes in the punting realm of any nature, really, including criminal investigations. We've got quite a lot of experience in the criminal gambling law. So traditional disputes over winnings or disputes with bookmakers, unfortunately, if they're worth it, that's just the reality of the situation, because I don't want to charge clients large sums of money to recover small sums of money. It's not a nice way to treat your clients. But look, I've also got to admit that increasingly I act for and advise independent bookmakers, which might frustrate. I know which might frustrate some of your listeners. But having done this for a very long time, I know an awful lot about the kind of way it all works and about the way that the Gambling Commission work and the rules and how to help them when they're in disputes with their regulator or indeed with customers sometimes. So I've always said I work on both sides of the fence, albeit that last time we spoke, it was more so on the side of the punter. To be honest, it's probably more 50-50 now. I don't think that still remains the case. I don't think I'm going to have any of the big boys knocking at my door in a hurry just because I've litigated most of them and they probably don't like me very much. But also, I think, as I said last time, an awful lot of what they do is largely indefensible, or has been over the years indefensible. But really anything in gambling, because there are so few people who sort of, I suppose, understand it from the ground up. I act for on-course bookmakers all the way up to, quite large, very rich people, but also quite large independent bookmakers, and have been doing that for a very long time. And the links with horse racing and with disciplinary law in horse, disciplinary disputes in the BHA has been a real help in having a sort of really kind of 360 understanding of all the issues that come up.
Well, if people want to hear you as well, they'll be able to come and do doing a live recording at the Smart Bash, which is recording this, it'll go out the end of June. So ahead of that, you're doing a live recording with the team there at AK Bets, and you'll be with us at Smart Bash if people want to meet you as well. But if people want to find out more about what you do, I'll put all your contact and website information in the show notes for this episode, so people can go and discover more about what you do. And obviously they can listen to you every week, every Monday morning on the Racing Room as well with the AK Bets team. And it's a good listen. Invariably there are very topical questions that come up every week involving betting that require your insight. And I glean a lot from that. So recommended listening for people wanting to know more from you, Harry. So thank you ever so much for coming on today. I will see you in a couple of weeks, and I appreciate you answering all the questions today.
Thanks very much, Pete. I'm very much looking forward to Smart Bash, and thanks for having me on again.